Well, Steve, thanks for that kind introduction. I think somebody once said there's something about being the last class before lunch. But I hope I'm able to keep you awake, because really the inspiration for me is everybody sitting in this room, and I'll talk about that here in just a second. I want to thank the University of Central Florida, certainly Lou Frey Institute, and if you've read his biography that's in the program, a really remarkable person. And I would add a Colgate grad. He enlisted in the Navy, graduated, became commissioned in the Navy, did a full career in the Navy, part as active duty, then part as reserve, then retired as a captain, then did a career as a congressman, then another career as a lawyer. So there's a lot of opportunity out there for everybody sitting in this room. Just think there isn't just one avenue to go, and obviously he's helped this organization immensely. Our relationship with UCF goes back almost a decade, thanks to Dr. John Bercia. They're part of our university program at the American Security Project. We were founded in 2005 by 4 senators, Kerry, Hagel, Hart, and Rudman. And at the time, Senator Kerry was not too happy with the outcome of the 2004 election, and he was trying to take politics out of a lot of the issues of the day, not the least of which was climate change, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but nuclear security, energy security, asymmetric operations, terrorism. There were a whole raft of issues that he felt whenever he spoke, he got painted as the left-wing liberal that he was. So his concept was, can I get somebody who's not politically oriented that can speak to national security issues? And he took 8 flag officers meaning admirals and generals, 2 from each service, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, recently retired, and let them talk to these issues from a non-political standpoint, but take the perspective of national security. Now, I understand this audience is obviously predominantly high school here, and you're thinking in your mind, you know, what am I going to be doing for the next 4 years or next 8 years or next 10 years? And I'm here to give you a little bit of advice from my previous job as Commanding General at Parris Island, and which you didn't mention, Steve. I ran recruiting for the Marine Corps for several years. There's a lot of options for everybody in this room, but I say option number 1 is stay in school, graduate. And if you go to the Google it, and you can figure out what the average pay of your high school graduate is, what your average pay of your college graduate is, what your average pay of somebody with a graduate degree is. So to put it in real hard sense there, it's a dollars and cents type thing, stay in school. So that's my first piece of advice. My next one is, it's a little early to be making firm decisions on where you're going, and you understand that. So listen to all your options. I would say go to college if at all you can, right away. Go to this college. This is a great school, a great institution. When I was in high school, and I graduated in 1967, so that's, you know, a millennial ago, I was wandering about and wondering where I was going to go. My dad had been in the service, so I went to the Naval Academy and did 4 years there. Now, those were very interesting times for our country. It was the height of the Vietnam War, and I will tell you, to be in uniform during that period was difficult. I'll give you one anecdotal story. I went to the co-op at Harvard in 1969. I was on the swim team. We swam against Harvard. Walked into the co-op in a midshipman's uniform and was literally, had pizza, food, drinks thrown at us. Were thrown out of the co-op because we were associated with the United States military. Those times have totally changed. Today now, I think what you see is a pretty good respect for the military. At least I see it. You see people in uniform. You appreciate that. I appreciate that. I appreciate those who have served, and it's also an option for everybody in this room. And my last pitch on the education side, I went to the Naval Academy, did my 4 years, and at the end of 4 years there I thought, thank God this is over, I'm never going back, and I'm done with school. Well, what does the Marines do? They send you straight to school. I went to the basic school, then I went to field artillery school, then I went out to the fleet, as you mentioned, artillery, did 3 years there, went back to school, to advanced artillery school, went back to the fleet. In 1983, I went to the Marine Corps Command and Staff College. Then in 1989, I went to the National War College. Then in 1993, I did a fellowship at the Council on Foreign Relations. My only point to this is, I'm not bragging about my background. Your education will never end. It will never end. Learn the study habits now, and it will stand you in good stead later, because if you think it's over when you graduate from high school, you're wrong. No matter what profession you've got, you're going to have to continue to study, continue to get those degrees, and that will continue no matter how old you are. And for me, my last fellowship was as a colonel, and I've been in the Marine Corps almost 30-plus years. Let me ask a quick question, everybody in the room. How many in here were born in 2000, 2001, 2002? Just a show of hands. Let me see. Just about everybody, right? Okay. So I'm doing, this is marine math now. In 2050, you're going to be 50. Hey, this guy's bright. But here's a statistic for you. Last month, the Arctic ice cap was the lowest at the smallest level it's ever been in recorded history. Now you're thinking, so what? That doesn't matter to me. In 2050, some are saying you will be able to drive a boat to the North Pole. And you're still saying, well, that's pretty interesting. Where's the impact here? Well, Orlando is going to be beachfront property. And that's an exaggeration, clearly. But what I'm not exaggerating is parts of Miami are going underwater. They can't stop it because of the porous underground and sea level rise. We've got bases and stations that belong to all our services that are already going underwater. Norfolk Naval Station cannot service its carriers because the docks are too low, so they've got to raise them. They have a problem. We've got bases in the Indian Ocean, Diego Garcia, 4 meters above sea level, probably going underwater. So we have an immediate problem with climate change. And here is something that some don't consider a national security aspect to it, but it's certainly affecting our bases and stations worldwide, and we've got to do something about it. Now, we know what's causing climate change, and I'm not going to sit up here and argue the science with you. You can Google it all day long. But what I will tell you is what Admiral Thad Allen, former Commandant of the Coast Guard, and I sat on a panel with him last week on the Arctic, will tell you. Somebody asked him if he believed in climate change. And Thad's response, and when he was Commandant, Thad's response was, well, you know, I'm responsible for all the water areas in the United States, and now there's a hell of a lot more water than there was 30 years ago. So whether there's climate change or not, there's more water now than there was before, so something is happening. Climate change is affecting your life, and it's going to affect it every day. In terms of quality of life, 2 weeks ago I spent several days in Havana. If you fly into Havana these days, you will look and see a huge smog layer over Havana. And to me, it was a stark realization that what we've done in this country to limit CO2 emissions has worked. Because I remember Los Angeles in the early 70s, which is nothing but a smog haze. Today, it's clean air. So our regulations have worked. And this leads me into what I'm going to talk about the first 100 days here. And this is a pretty interesting time, given that just 2 days ago, the president came out with an executive order basically rolling back most of the Obama climate change policies, certainly going after the Clean Air Plan, certainly reversing his executive orders. And we at the American Security Project are concerned about this because we think it impacts our national security. Now, when you talk about the war on coal, Vice President Pence said the war on coal is over. I will tell you, yes, it is over. It's not over for what he thinks it's over for. It's over because natural gas has overtaken coal big time as a producer of energy. And going that one step farther, solar and wind energy now is starting to overcome both of those. There are more people employed in the solar, wind energy, and the renewable energy sector today than there are in oil, gas, and nuclear combined. You don't hear too much of that from the administration. On November 17th, 2016, 45% of the total power consumed in Texas, the entire state of Texas, was produced by wind and solar. You don't hear that very much either. 50% of the power today that supplies our Midwest is provided by solar and wind. So those are stats you probably aren't hearing too much. But my point is this: the economics are going to drive this policy. It's not coal or coal policy or opening up coal mines or allowing them to burn more, which I think are actually bad things. But what's going to happen is the business people are going to look at it and go, it's cheaper to have solar and wind. It's a renewable. We can do that. Coal is dying a slow but long and permanent death. So that's my pitch on climate change. I'm going to switch a little bit to talk about what's going around the world and what's affected climate change in other continents. Sub-Saharan Africa, the Sahel, average daily temperature has been running in the summer high about 120, 125 degrees. Predicted in 10 years to run 135 to 145, 145 degrees. Just think about it. You can't live in that environment. Now, some would say, so what? What does that mean to me? You've got tens of millions of people living in sub-Saharan Africa. What's going to happen is they're going to migrate. They can't live there. They're going somewhere. They're not going south. They're going north. And if you think Europe has a problem with migration today, wait till you see 20 or 30 million people going across the Mediterranean because they cannot live in Africa. They are also prime targets for what's going on over there now, the instability with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram. Lake Chad, by the way, has been reduced by about 70 to 80%. Boko Haram has taken advantage of that. These are tough times in Africa and will impact us because they're going to cause instability in Europe, and you recognize the problems we have in Europe, and I know Matthew's going to talk about some of this. Let me migrate a little bit farther around in the world and go to Bangladesh. It's another one you think, it doesn't impact me. 1.5 foot level of sea rise in Bangladesh is 30 million refugees. 30 million. And you think, wow. They have a fence border between Bangladesh and India that looks just like what was the Berlin Wall during the Cold War. I've got pictures of it. If you cross that particular wall, you get shot. My point is, those in Bangladesh are not going to India, they're not going to Burma. They're going to become boat people. They're going to go somewhere in Southeast Asia. Could it be Indonesia? Indonesia, by the way, is the largest Muslim country in the world. Some don't recognize that. Another one that's volatile. It's a pinpoint or a flashpoint for instability. These 20 to 30 million could roll in there. You're going to have huge problems in Southeast Asia. So I mentioned this to give you just some poignant examples of problems that are occurring worldwide thanks to climate change and somewhat to energy security. They're interrelated. They impact us daily. And of course, the current administration has taken a different tack on some of these things, which my organization does not necessarily appreciate. But I think we can get into a lot more of this on the Q&A. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matthew Wallen.
Thank you, General Cheney. I'm a little younger than most people on the panels here today, and that being said, I did not graduate high school in the 60s. I graduated high school in 2002. During my senior year, I was arriving just on campus as we heard that 2 airplanes had hit the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and had gone down in Pennsylvania. And it was quite a shock, even living in Los Angeles. And at least for me, I think it was right then that I decided what I needed to do in life, and that was to figure out what America could do better in the world. To figure out, at the time, the question was, why do they hate us? And as I have done my education and learning and have gone into DC, the question goes well beyond that, and it's more, what don't we understand about the rest of the world? So I'm going to speak a little bit about how we understand that better and how we improve relations and why it matters. Now, back in the 60s, as we had mentioned, we had an organization called the United States Information Agency. It was tasked with explaining America to the world and explaining the world to America. This organization no longer exists. It was disbanded in the 90s after the Cold War and has become part of the State Department, which handles our foreign relations overseas. At the time, the director of the U.S. Information Agency was a very famous individual, a trusted journalist who had spent his early years reporting on World War II in Great Britain and would speak to the American people with the opening words, "This is London." That man was Edward R. Murrow, and I think the words that he said during congressional testimony in 1963 are really important for today, how we view things like fake news and how we understand that this country should present itself to the world. He said to Congress that American traditions and the American ethic require us to be truthful. But the most important reason is that truth is the best propaganda and lies are the worst. To be persuasive, we must be believable. To be believable, we must be credible. To be credible, we must be truthful. It is as simple as that. And I think those are words that we should be paying very close attention to today. I don't want to get too political, but I think it is very, very concerning when the President of the United States states things that are patently and provably untrue. You cannot say something on the world stage and then deny you have said it 5 minutes later. It's unacceptable, and we should hold our president and our politicians to higher standards. Now, that being said, given that information, we can look at a few ways that we can help improve our image around the world. Why does this matter? America first. And to an extent, that is important. We should focus on our country first. America should be a priority to our politicians and to our people. We can't sacrifice the needs and the interests of our own country for the rest of the world. But that doesn't tell the whole story. So there's a few ways we can practice what is called public diplomacy. Now, what is public diplomacy? It's not Secretary of State Tillerson speaking to Foreign Minister Lavrov in Russia and having private conversations. That's traditional diplomacy. Public diplomacy has been around for a very long time, and we see it on a daily basis, we just don't know what to call it. So there's a few ways we can do this. One is called advocacy. That is the United States government talking to people in foreign countries, not talking to other governments. We're talking to people. It could be people talking to people. But the point is to build relationships with the people in other countries so that we can understand and build trust in each other and come to better policy solutions. Ultimately, the point of doing this is so that we can achieve our foreign policy. We don't do this for fluffy bunnies and kittens. We do this because we want to influence what foreign governments do. And ideally, in a democracy, and even sometimes in a dictatorship, you can influence the people in that country to make changes in their own government. Part of that process, we might find out that that doesn't work, but I'll get into that in a minute. So advocacy, we tell them, this is our policy, you should believe us, this is why we do this. Another way to do this is through exchange programs. If you know anybody who's studying in school from another country, whether that's high school, college, that's an important thing. That's a way that we build relationships, because we're exposing not only ourselves but other people to our country and our country to other people. Just to put things in perspective, there's about 1 million exchange students in the United States today, and they contribute quite a bit to our economy. They don't cost us very much to do because they pay out-of-state tuition, which you'll find out about at some point. But these 1 million students contribute greatly, and they form a network that we can tap later on. Another way we can do it is called international broadcasting. Now, that doesn't have much of a sound to it. Yeah, CNN does international broadcasting, the BBC does international broadcasting, but we're talking about state-funded, that is the US government pays a news organization in the United States and runs it essentially to explain the United States overseas. So we have something called Voice of America. And when Voice of America was formed in 1942, it told people located throughout Europe who were under Nazi rule that we will always tell you the truth. And it might not be good for us, it might not be favorable to us, but you will always know the truth from us. That set us apart from the other broadcasters in the world. So Voice of America, something called Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, these are the organizations that we fund to explain America and sometimes explain what's going on in a country where they might not have access to free information. We also do cultural diplomacy. That's music exchange, that's artistic exchange. That's sending the New York Philharmonic to North Korea, which we did a number of years ago. We have what I call the most listening, or the most important part, and I just gave it away, is listening. And that's not just telling people in other countries what to do or what they should do or about America. That's actually listening to what they have to say to us, because this gives us the ability to better understand and plan for contingencies and moving forward with relationships. Relationship building has been brought up earlier in the day, and it's really key, because if you're going to try to convince somebody that they should take a certain action or believe a certain thing, why are they going to believe you if you're not willing to listen to them? What do they have to tell you? What are their concerns? And how can you take what they tell you and use it to formulate better ways to accomplish your objectives? So if I want X country to join on to a climate change agreement, how do we do that? Well, we listen to people in the country, find out what's going on, we learn who are the important people, we learn who we can talk to, we learn the issues that they're dealing with, and we use that to create a plan to work with the people in that country to move that country to join that climate change agreement. So listening is really important. And I will briefly say that the other side of things that we can use, and that's for a whole nother discussion, is psychological warfare. That gets into fun stuff like propaganda. So, moving on from the public diplomacy side, I want to talk a little bit about NATO security in Europe. This has been a big issue over the course of the presidential campaign. NATO, which is the security agreement we've had with many European countries since the end of World War II, which has essentially preserved the peace in Europe for the past 70 years, is a key aspect of American security. Yes, we pay a lot of the defense costs. That's our choice to do that. The NATO agreement requires that countries should be paying about 2% of their GDP. That's basically all the money that they spend in that country. About 2% towards their defense. A lot of countries don't do that. They're moving towards that. The most important aspect of NATO is something called the Article 5 agreement. That is an agreement that if one country in that alliance is attacked, then all countries are attacked and all countries must come to that country's defense. In the course of NATO, that has been done very rarely. One time that was done was after September 11th. That was for us. And our partners contributed for us in Afghanistan and have done so since we have been there. Then candidate Trump had mentioned that we might not come to a country's defense if they don't pay their share of the bill. Fair criticism. They should be paying their share of the bill. However, to risk saying that we will not come to another country's defense completely defeats the point of NATO and the purpose. Why does this matter? Because it stopped Russia from interfering with Europe for the last 70 years. Militarily, at least. Now, they do this through election politics and that sort of thing, but again, that's a whole other discussion. So NATO is very important to us. But Russia's a little freaked out about NATO, and that's understandable. And we've made certain promises with regards to NATO after the Cold War that Russia has listened to very carefully. In 1990, when we were putting Germany back together, we had discussions with Gorbachev at the time, basically saying that, yeah, we wouldn't expand NATO anymore, not one more inch to the east, we said. And we also said that the extension of NATO, the NATO zone, was unacceptable. A number of years later, that's obviously not true, and just the other day, the Senate has basically approved the ascension of Montenegro to join NATO. So this is something that Russia is very worried about, and we have to understand that when we make promises, whether verbal or written, we have to keep to those promises, because that gets back to the first thing I brought up today, which is credibility. People don't believe we're going to keep our promises, we're not credible. In 1993, we were talking to then Boris Yeltsin, and we said we were going to have a partnership for peace. Russia was going to be part of it. This wouldn't be about membership. This would be about anybody being able to join and to work on the issues that Europe had in terms of security together. That kind of fell through. Yeltsin was really excited about it at the time, was very enthusiastic, and a year later, Bill Clinton said, oh, by the way, we're probably going to be expanding NATO. But don't worry about that. That'll be way down the line. A few years later, we were already bringing Poland in. So, about those promises. So, why does this all matter? Well, this gets down to something that's really scary, and this is nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are something that we hear about, but we don't really think about what they've done to the history of this country. My parents, maybe some of your grandparents, spent their time in high school learning how to hide under desks for the fear of nuclear annihilation. Bert the Turtle was explaining that, you know, when the nuclear weapons come, look for the flash, get under your desk. That wouldn't have helped anyone. We really have to consider the power of these weapons. We have thousands of them, and now we've been working to reduce them for many years. It has been American policy to reduce them, not only in the United States, but in Russia and around the world. This is about non-proliferation, preventing other countries from getting nuclear weapons. And statements from the president have mentioned that, you know, if Russia doesn't like what we're doing with nuclear weapons and we don't like what they're doing with nuclear weapons, then let there be an arms race. We are so far beyond that, we do not need to do that. President Reagan once said that nuclear weapons were basically the only point of having them was to not use them. That's the whole point. So we spend billions and billions and billions and billions, we're talking hundreds of billions over the next 10 years, we're projected to spend about $800 billion to $1 trillion in terms of modernizing our old weapons and delivery systems, because these things haven't been really updated much since the 1970s. So we have to make some choices about what we want to spend money on. Do we want to spend money on weapons that we can't use, or do we want to spend money on weapons and armor and material and training that we could be using to defend our armed forces that are actually serving in combat overseas? Now, ideally, what we want to do with Russia is to reduce both of our weapons, both of our stockpiles together. And we did that in the past administration and during the Reagan administration and during the previous Bush administration through arms agreements. And these have been really key. They say, for instance, the New START agreement, which is our latest arms agreement with Russia, that we want to have no more than 1,550 nuclear weapons each pointed at each other and ready to fire. That's what we have right now. It's enough to destroy each other several times over. We've got still 3,000 to 4,000 more sitting in stockpile, and Russia has the same. The President of the United States said that New START was a bad deal, but here's why it's not a bad deal. It lets us know what the Russians have, and it lets the Russians know what we have. We have inspectors that go to each other's countries. They look at the weapons. They see that they're there. We count them. We make sure that they're there and that we're not hiding anything. These weapons are dangerous. It only takes one mistake. Well, how many mistakes have been made with nuclear weapons? Well, there's plenty. You know, during the 60s, we had airplanes collided with each other. Nuclear weapons fell out. They hit the ground. They were one safety mechanism away from detonating on our own soil. A few years ago, we had a B-52 fly across our country, landed at an air base, and sat on the runway for a few hours before somebody noticed, wait a minute, are those nuclear weapons deployed on the wings? Well, yes, they are. Well, who signed for those? I don't know. So these issues matter. And if you think that that kind of safety record is bad in the United States, it's potentially even worse in the Soviet Union. It took us almost 20 years to secure an area where the Soviet Union had left nuclear material that anybody could dig up out of the ground to make nuclear weapons. 20 years. But this is important. This is about why it's key to talk to Russia, to talk to China, to talk to our other allies that have nuclear weapons and make sure that we're all working to reduce these dangerous weapons together. Now, I'm not saying we should get rid of them completely. Nuclear weapons have been key, essentially, in preventing World War III. We all know that if World War III breaks out, it will probably be nuclear. But it has helped to keep the peace. I mean, let's put things in perspective. World War II killed 100 million people. 100 million. If that was today, you know, a good half of you probably would be at war right now. Korea was smaller, Vietnam was smaller. All the conflicts that have happened since then have been significantly smaller. And there is still reason to keep them ready just in case we need them for whatever purpose. And there's also asteroids for those of you who watch the movies. But we could all do better with less. It's the right direction to move, and I hope we are going to be moving that way in the future. So I'll wrap up there.
So thank you both for some excellent remarks on national security, climate change, and NATO, nuclear weapons, and all that other wonderful stuff. I do have a question to begin with, and then we'll open it up to the floor. And the question I have is for General Cheney. You talked a lot about climate security, migration, energy security. And you didn't mention necessarily, though, what's happening in Iraq, and especially what's left of Syria. So how have those really been impacted?
Yeah, Steve, great questions. And I think everybody follows the news and see what's going on in both Iraq and Syria and Turkey as well, and Yemen is another part to this whole thing. And the bottom line on this, and some don't agree with me when I say this, is the current administration has basically followed the policy of the last administration, and that's let others do the fight, we'll provide the support, with a couple of exceptions. They have accelerated the number of U.S. troops that are in Iraq and now put some into Syria. A Marine artillery battery is there with supporting element actively engaged. I think technically they say they are not in combat, but I don't know how you have an artillery battery shooting rounds and they're not in combat, but it's escalated a little bit, but nonetheless that fight is still being carried on by mostly Iraqi forces, and we're supporting, of course, those who are friendly to us in Syria. It's a very, very complicated issue, one that I think progress has been made, and I do believe the President's prediction. We're going to defeat ISIS. I think it will happen. I think it will, in Iraq, it will happen this year. Then they'll go into Syria, could create safe zones, is what I'm hearing now, and they'll start to work on that issue. Of course, it gets complicated with the Russians as well and with the Turks. The bottom line of this is it's not going away any near-term time. We will have troop presence in Iraq and perhaps Syria for many, many years to come. But to be more on the optimist than the pessimist side, we're going to defeat ISIS in Iraq, and we're going to make some significant progress in Syria, but it's going to be hard. And I'll put in one more tagline on Syria. A couple of days ago, it was mentioned that they now have a huge water shortage in Syria. They had the worst drought in their history from 2006 to 2011, caused by climate change. And what happened there was the farmers, those who were growing crops, all moved into the big cities. One of them called Aleppo, who you may be familiar with. They became, one, huge targets for Assad, And secondly, of course, there was a lot of instability and a lot of unemployment, especially against the younger males. Huge target for ISIS. And when ISIS rolled in there to a young man or young father who's trying to provide for his family, and they say, we'll give you money, we'll give you food, to the unmarried one, we'll give you a wife and we'll give you a gun and let you go shoot people, that had an attraction. And that's how they got traction in Syria, and it was horrible. And it's still there. I mean, they are the worst of the worst. But I think we're making progress there.
And I'm interested in a career in international relations. What are some things that are available in that area of government, and what paths should I take?
You've got a long path ahead of you, but with many, 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 many choices. I'll go back to some of my original comments. Get on a student exchange if you can. Go study in another country. If you've got foreign language expertise, that's definitely a plus. The little amount of French that I speak has served me not very well, probably because I can't speak it very well, but it opens opportunities and avenues. If you've got in-person experience in another country, that's very, very desirable. Although if you go through the security clearance process, which will happen if you join the State Department or other organizations that require a clearance, essentially, it complicates things because they want to know everybody that you've known over the past so many years, especially people in other countries. But yeah, you could go to the State Department. There are options within Congress on staff to do research on the various committees. There are nonprofit organizations, things like the International Red Cross, other organizations that maybe even run exchange programs or things overseas. And there's organizations like us, think tanks essentially, that write and research on policy issues. There are a lot of those in the DC region. But it's also good to start connecting some of these things outside of the DC area. So if there are opportunities here in Florida or in other states, sometimes even in the private sector, running things like trade. It's going to be a key issue, and it's something the president has made very important, is trade. So there are lots of people who are looking for expertise in countries, and if you can demonstrate that expertise, you've got a lot of options.
And before I ask my question, I just want to say thank you for giving me the chance to speak at one of these, John. And my question is, do y'all believe we should put forth more effort to the environmental issues? Because, I mean, we all know we got a lot of them, and they're something serious. Or should we put in less and focus on other things?
Well, it's a great question, and there's a ton of issues that are on the plates of everybody in the administration today. And I mentioned the Clean Power Plan and what happened with the executive order this past week. So it's a balancing act, of course. We feel at the American Security Project fairly strongly about environmental issues, to protect our environment, certainly in terms of pollution, to stop CO2 emissions, to stop global warming. I did not mention during my remarks that we had signed up to what's called the Paris Accord a couple years back, which committed us, along with now it's over 130 other countries, to limiting our CO2 contribution, and said it can be reduced some 25 or 26% by year 2028. The fear right now, of course, is that the current administration might pull out of the Paris Accord. They've held two meetings, what's called COP21, Conference of Paris Parties 21 in Paris 2 years back, and then the Conference of Parties 22, which was Marrakesh, which helped provide the funding for this. So, of course, our hope is that the current administration adheres to our commitment to Paris and stays there. Just yesterday, and I think this morning, both China and Russia have come on board saying they're going to support their commitment, where's ours. So we feel strongly about the environmental side of the House.
My question is, if the Trump administration pulls us from the Paris Agreement, how will that affect us and climate change? Like, how will that affect the way we deal with climate change?
Yeah, I mean, if you could hear her question in the back, she asked, if they pull out of the Paris Accord, what's the impact, I think is what you asked. And, well, the impact is we're abandoning a commitment that we made, for number one. Secondly, we're going to allow other countries to take the lead in this area, not the least of which is China and perhaps Russia and others. And then we will perhaps lift the cap on our emissions in this country and contribute to further pollution of the atmosphere and increase in temperatures. They're trying to limit it to a 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperatures over the next decade plus. Abandoning that just shows that we don't care, and it's a huge problem. I think it's a huge problem. It's going to be a national security issue. As I mentioned, the Arctic ice cap's melting. If we don't stop the CO2 contribution, it will melt. Your sea level will rise. You will have problems, not just here in this country, but it's going to be a worldwide, real worldwide problem here. And I didn't get into the fact that they're trying to cut the Coast Guard's budget 30%. Coast Guard's going to have to send icebreakers up to cover what's left in the Northern Sea route. I mean, this all is complicated but intertwined, and it's going to have a severe impact.
I might add just a little bit about that, getting back to that credibility issues. When we sign an agreement, we should stick to the agreement. That's the word of the United States, and we are supposed to be a country that keeps its word, not only to our allies, but to anybody around the world. If we say we are going to attack you, then we should attack you. If we say that we are going to defend you, we should defend you. If we say we want to help reduce climate change and we sign on to an agreement that says that we should do that, then we should do that. It matters across all negotiations, both violent and nonviolent, that the word of the United States should matter. Because if we don't stick to our word, why should anybody else? We're supposed to be leaders in the world, and we have to demonstrate that.
We've heard a lot today about how technology has advanced and how we should be warned against relying too much on technology. But my question is there any way that the technological advances could help provide a more positive outlook on our national security and international relations?
So on the public diplomacy side of the house, the internet has been great to an extent. It allows us to reach an audience that we've never been able to reach before. And you think about it, the size of the State Department is about 60,000 individuals. Let's say about half of those are based in D.C. and the rest are overseas. You've got roughly one Best Buy full of people working an entire country in each country overseas. That's not many. So how do you reach a country of, say, 140, 150 million? How do you reach a country like China, which has over 1 billion people with 70 people? It's difficult. So the internet allows us to reach out to many more that we would never otherwise be able to see in person. It allows for a greater exchange of ideas and communication. It allows you to reach and hear voices that you wouldn't otherwise hear. But you still get into some of that manpower issue or woman power about how do you process all this information? How do you deal with that number of people? And hopefully there are some technological solutions to help deal with this, to process information. But technology, it's both a plus and a minus. You can't rely too much on these sorts of things. You can't rely on the internet to do all of your hard work overseas. You have to go out there, get out of your embassies, get out of your chair, get out from behind the screen and meet people in person, because if you're not building those relationships in person, it's hard to know what you're actually getting out of them. And the internet's tempting. We've discussed this earlier. It's easy to click here to save the world, but if you're not actually out there and saving it, then clicking does nothing.
My question is about Syria, because I know you touched on this a little bit earlier. Is accepting foreign refugees a common international diplomatic method? Is it effective? And is the U.S.'s and Trump's limited involvement with the refugee programs, is that going to affect our foreign policy?
I presume you're asking about his current policy to limit those coming in from the 7 countries in the Middle East. Is that correct? Well, it's the message he certainly wants to send in terms of limiting potential terrorists coming from those particular countries. Unfortunately, it's been viewed as definitely against a restriction against Muslims coming into this country. It's a religious thing based instead of it's country-based or terrorist-based. Perhaps not thought out well to start with, obviously. Rolled it out too quick. Didn't work. Came back, redid it, put it back out. Took Iraq off the list. But still left several others on there. Could he do it? It remains for the courts to settle. It's being adjudicated in several state courts. I think Hawaii is one of them that has challenged it, although there are some others now that are going to uphold it. So this is one that'll be fought in the court system. My ASP position is we ought to be an open country, that it ought to be not based on religion or background. I'm very familiar with the vetting process of getting refugees in from the Middle East It is extensive. It is extremely hard. Despite some of the comments from the current administration about making the vetting process harder, it takes 2+ years right now for a refugee to apply and get through that whole system to get here. So I think a fair amount of it was publicity driven, but we'll see how it stands in the court system.
The other thing about refugees, and we turned them away by the boatloads during the Holocaust, is we have a power in this country to help people, and I think we should now. Should we be able to help everyone? No, we're obviously not the world's policemen. But this is where diplomacy matters, and getting down to the causes of why are there refugees in the first place? Maybe it's climate, maybe it's war, maybe it's political disagreements, between people and countries. What can we do to reduce the cause of there being refugees in the first place? You can bring them in and you can save those lives, but that doesn't help the other people who you haven't been able to save. And you need to work the diplomatic process both with people you don't like and people you do like to help reduce the number of refugees that are being caused in the first place.
And as far as the nuclear missiles go, is it ever explained why they have to be nuclear instead of like regular missiles that wouldn't destroy the world?
Well, the bottom line there is that you can't put the genie back in the bottle, essentially. Once nuclear weapons were created, they weren't going to disappear, and there were periods during the early part of the Cold War where we were very much considering using them, and we had very much considered using them during even the Korean War. That wouldn't have been pleasant because it's right around the time that the Soviet Union was developing their first nuclear weapons. So the idea with nuclear deterrence now is, and this has been sort of the way we've done it for the past 60 years, is that if you've got nuclear weapons, your adversary has them too. The only way to stop each other from using them is to have the same amount or more. It's called mutually assured destruction. If I use them, you use them, and we both lose. So it's difficult to disarm your side completely and have them not be nuclear, because then the other side goes, well, I have an advantage now, and I can win a nuclear war against that country and eliminate that threat. So it's a very tricky balance, and it's a dangerous balance, and that's why we try to negotiate those numbers of missiles down at the same time as each other.
And my question is directed towards General Cheney specifically. One of the administration's strategies in Syria that has been mentioned is to put American soldiers on the ground there to sort of create safe zones for the refugees from the war and have American soldiers protect refugees in Syria. That's from the civilian leadership, which is often optimistic and out of base with what the real situation is. From the military perspective, how probable is it that we can do that? We can put American soldiers on the ground in Syria to protect refugees and not get involved in a shooting war, given that the situation there on the ground is so delicate?
Great question, and I will tell you, personally knowing General Jim Mattis, who's the Secretary of Defense, he and I served together for many, many years. He spent decade plus in that theater of operation. He clearly understands what the cost is and what it takes to make a safe zone. And there are differing perspectives on this, and your definition of safe zone plays into this. Now, some would say a no-fly zone. Well, a no-fly zone implies nobody's flying. And it's much easier to do a no-fly zone than a safe zone, i.e. you just destroy the other guy's air assets, or you have enough air defense to not allow anybody to fly there. But a safe zone, by definition, is a place where you can go on the ground and be safe from both the ground and the aviation perspective. So my point to this is, and Jim Mattis understands it well, depending on the size of the zone and where it is, it's very labor intensive. You need not just hundreds of troops, probably thousands. A safe zone on the size of, let's say, 20 or 30 miles would probably require several regiments, or maybe on the order of a division of soldiers or Marines. So you're talking 10 to 20,000 Marines or soldiers. I mean, that's a lot of folks. Or what I think you're going to see here is they're going to try and have our allies, the coalition, provide the manpower to do that on the ground, where we'll do the air power, which is probably the answer. And I'll wager a bet here that that's what you're going to see. is they're going to create a safe zone in Syria. They're going to use coalition ground forces. The size of it is going to be interesting, and where it is going to be equally interesting. How close to Turkey are the Kurds going to be in that safe zone? So you've got a lot of politics involved here. But my bet is you're going to see some kind of safe zone, and you'll probably see it this year.